The importance of today's particular passage that we've just had read to us from Genesis chapter 1 and the latter portions thereof is specifically relating to the broader topic or focus of what we'll be looking at this morning. For those who weren't here last week, we examined the opening 3 verses, or 2 verses really, of Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then we looked at what that meant, that the earth and all that was formless and void. We examined how this primordial chaos was made, and then God ordered that chaos. And our God indeed is a God of order, and the very primacy and primordial origins of our universe come from God ordering this chaos. We looked at how, in brevity, the structure of the way that this is presented to us in Genesis 1 is in fact further communicating to us this idea of order. This essentially epic poem that is Genesis chapter 1 is very structured, very rigid. It follows a pattern and is all about examining the fact and exploring and proclaiming forth the reality that indeed we and everything that we see did not eternally exist. The gods did not come forth from creation, but rather there is one divine, eternal, true, sovereign God from whom and by whom and for whom all things have come. Very macroscopic in scope. Today we'll be moving down to the more human level, I suppose, the somewhat more microscopic level. Namely, what we will be doing is focusing on the concept of the imago Dei, the image of God. And we'll be exploring it in the context of our broader series here, Christ or Chaos, specifically as it relates to the dominant narrative of how we as human beings are by nature. We'll be examining the influence in light of this passage of Darwinism and of evolutionary thought and ideas. And we'll be examining, as part of this broader series, how the Christian message, A, stands in direct contrast to that, why it's important that we understand that, and how that then fits into our thinking and our framing and our actions in society and in the culture in which we live. Okay? These kinds of issues become really important when we think specifically about how we do apologetics, right? Or in other words, how we evangelize. How we proclaim the gospel, how we define it for starters, how we frame it in our own worldview, and then how that interacts and often collides with the worldviews and the ideologies that exist outside the 4 walls. Okay? It is not trivial matters. It is also not something that we can be generally amateurish or even just ignorant of. We see examples countless times throughout the scriptures of the prophets or even the apostles interacting with the worldviews of their day. One of the most famous examples in the New Testament from Acts is Paul's engagement, his speech at the Areopagus in Athens, where he's speaking before a number of particularly Stoic and Epicurean philosophers in this central hub, in the beating heart of philosophy and religion in the empire in Athens. Paul, being an educated man, a very educated man, going through one of the most prestigious Jewish schools, having attended a Greek university in Tarsus, knew what these things were. He knew Stoic philosophy. He knew Epicurean philosophy. Not just for the sake of rote, kind of meaningless, high convoluted academia, but rather for the purpose of actually engaging people in the culture around him. So the reason why we're examining these issues, the reason why next week we're examining the idea of postmodernism and truth, why we're examining secularism as the dominant theology, philosophy, ideology of our society, is so that we as a church, you as individuals, as well as how you teach your family or perhaps even your grandchildren coming up, you can be far more prepared to actually teach them the true ways of the Lord. When your child or grandchild talks about what they've learnt at school that day, when they come home confused because they're getting one message at home and an entirely different message at school, we need to know how on earth to actually communicate that to the next generation. You see what I'm getting at? We need to know what we stand for and what we stand against, because we can't advance on a proverbial enemy without knowing what on earth that enemy actually believes. So let's now dive into our exposition of Genesis 1, and we'll move from there. Let's pick up in verse 24. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds." Now this word kinds is a fairly generic word in English, but nevertheless it is referencing something quite particular. It is referencing, namely, that there is, again, as is the case throughout this chapter, there is an order, and there is an inherent ordering in terms of the action of God. He is bringing forth creatures according to their kind. Obviously, the other more notable reference to this term is in relation to Noah and the ark, animals coming forth of their kind. Just wanted to point that out. Livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. Verse 25, and God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. He saw that this ordering and this bringing forth, this structuring of creation, of reality, of the world that we live, is inherently good. By the time he gets to the end of this day 6, he declares that it is very good. But those details about every animal being brought forth in its kind is not just simply to gloss over, because what it's done here, poetically speaking, is it's framed directly in contrast to what then comes immediately after. The fact that we then get a, at least by comparison, rather detailed explanation or a more specific explanation of the creation of mankind is a point of separation. It's a point of delineation, purposefully from a poetic standpoint, purposefully from a literary one. And how we then read that, the lens through which we actually interpret and understand that, becomes important for how we view ourselves as human, how we view ourselves as a creation, as a creature. You have the animals being brought forth in their kind, and then literally and poetically there's a shift in the text to the height of that creation, the apex of that, which then comes afterwards. That viewpoint alone, often stands in contrast of the old religions, of the ancient religions. We saw last week, at least in reference, the fact that in the Enuma Elish, in the Babylonian creation myth, which was existent and was dominant at the time period in which Genesis was collated, humanity was essentially created as nothing more than a tool for Marduk and the other gods to be able to hold off Tiamat and the forces of chaos. Really nothing more than tools. Often throughout many of the religions of the world, humanity is nothing more than, at best, a plaything, and at worst, often just proverbial slaves, either literally or figuratively, to be the playthings of the gods. Often in ancient Greek mythology, that's exactly what humanity was. So many of the great mythological stories of ancient Greece are not so much about humanity, it's more about the gods. The first great epic piece of Greek literature, the Iliad, about the Trojan War, figures like Achilles, Hector, etc., wasn't about the human figures. It wasn't really about the human nature of the war. It was about all the gods who had picked sides, and Athena fought for them, and Artemis fought for them, and so on and so forth. Because that's all that humanity could possibly be in a world where they have come forth from the creation as the actual gods themselves have come forth from the creation. But then we have to ask ourselves this. If that be the case in the old religions which have come, have gone, have been cast upon the ash pile of history and been blown away with the sands of time, especially as Christianity has gone forth and conquered them, what then are we to understand much of the very, very pagan religion of naturalism or atheism? If that be the view of humanity in the old religions, what then be the view of humanity under the dominant philosophy, theology, ideology of today, which we might very broadly call secularism? Naturalistic, materialistic, atheistic secularism. This worldview, this ideological structure in which the full, total and outright rejection of the divine has occurred, in which there is no supernatural or metaphysical or divine component to reality in any way, shape or form, and the only thing that exists is the material or naturalistic world. What then is the view in that dominant philosophy, which is then taught as absolute, unquestionable doctrine and dogma in our public schools? Because at least in the old religions, at least there were gods that came forth from the creation. At least there was a natural hierarchy. At least there was a system of at least elemental reverence for a divine component that resided above humanity. What then when a culture has done away with any sense of divine authority at all, leaving just us at the top? This is why we have to understand the just almost incalculable significance of what we're about to read now. So let's do it and we'll explain from there. Verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." The usage of the plural term "our" is fascinating to study in the Hebrew. It's not the focus of this morning because it would become a sermon in and of itself. But it's interesting to note and to think of it from a Trinitarian perspective. Nevertheless, let's continue. "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heaven, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." In other words, everything that just got mentioned in verses 24 and 25. Then that seminal verse in 27. "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." That one single verse, structured in a very, very Hebrew fashion, is the very basis for virtually every single area of theology you could possibly think of. All the way down to areas that you might not necessarily connect. Areas concerning the gospel itself. The reality of that verse determines the very real human nature of Jesus. It determines the very real nature of the divine salvation of mankind. It determines the very real nature of the very real salvation of human beings and entrance into the presence of God himself. Without that verse, all of that goes away. Every last possible thing you can humanly imagine along those lines that I just mentioned is gone if that verse isn't there. If that verse proclaiming forth the reality that human beings are specially and specifically created in the image of God, and we'll get into that in a second, the reality of that verse determines how we view not just reality at large, but it indeed determines how we view ourselves as creatures in that reality. It determines how we view the very God who created reality, who has ordered this universe. Why? Multitudes of reasons. The first of which is that none of that which has been mentioned in verses 24 and 25, which is then repeated in verse 26, is mentioned in the context of the Imago Dei, of the image of God. There has been a shift, as I said, poetically and literarily, to a specific focus on humanity being made in this image of this God who is creating the world, who is ordering reality. That designation and the specific nature of that creation has far-reaching implications. There's a variety of different ways that we could possibly understand this concept of the Imago Dei, of the image of God. You can boil it down to very simple things, or at least seemingly simple things, like communication. Technically that would be a way, but there are far more sophisticated answers as to what this concept of being in the image, being in one sense a reflection of, which is what this term image is meaning here. It's a reflection. You can think of it, if you want to think of it analogously, you can think of it almost in the sense of a mirror. In one sense, the mirror and the image that you see in that mirror is not the actual person, right? That mirror and what you're seeing isn't you, but it is a reflection of you. An image on a coin, right? Say of Her Majesty on the coin of Australia, is not Her Majesty, obviously, but it's an image, it's a reflection. It's a typecast that is significant, and the fact that it is an image in that sense, that it is a reflection, has massive implications on how we understand the nature of that thing. But it is, of course, obviously not the thing itself. What this means pragmatically, we can spend all day talking about. We could look and examine the fact of the spiritual component and the spiritual reality of humanity, the fact that we are endowed with a soul, with a spirit, the fact that we have what we might broadly call spiritual faculties. As much as we have physical faculties, mental or intellectual faculties, we have spiritual faculties as well. That is a reflection of this God who is inherently spirit, who is inherently divine in that fashion. The capacities for love, for fellowship, for all of these various things is too encompassed in that understanding of being made in the image of God. It itself is a sermon series. But today for us, the reality that we are made in this image of God, whilst being a concept that to us as Christians is it's fairly run-of-the-mill, right? It's a fairly common, understood concept. It's important for us, perhaps more important than literally ever in the history of the church, to actually highlight, understand, elevate, and proclaim forth that reality. That not just us, but all mankind, every last person in our society is made in the image of God. If not for the simple reason, before you even begin to talk anything else, for the simple reason that the absolute categorical opposite of that is what is taught as dogma in our public education system. When your children or your grandchildren go to school, particularly high school, they are being taught as a matter of fundamental dogmatic principle that this verse is a load of rubbish. That this verse is patently false, that this verse is a fundamental lie. That in fact, not only have they not been made in the image of God, they are to be merely counted among the proverbial ranks of that which came before in verses 24 and 25. That they are nothing more, that you and I are nothing more than primates that have evolved over the course of hundreds of thousands to tens of millions of years, that we are simply the extant species of primate in our line of the Homo genus that has evolved to this point. We have out-survived the others, and that we, at the end of the day, are nothing more than cousins of the other 7 primates. The fundamental ideology that is being taught in our public education, and if I'm being perfectly honest, seeps very much over into our private education, has far-reaching and probably actually incalculable influence and impact upon how our children are raised, upon the kind of people that then are brought up into our society. When you educate children for years and years on end that they are nothing more than just a simple animal species, that there is nothing beyond the natural, material, physical world, that concepts like the divine or even objective notions of truth, of logic, of reason, and all these various abstract realities, which we're going to talk about mostly next week, the concept that all those are mere fanciful machinations of the old religions of the Dark Ages, but now that we're so enlightened that we've come to a far greater understanding and we now know the truth, we're then shocked for some reason when generations turn out to be abjectly atheist, and worse yet, very lazily atheistic, with an inability to think, with an inability to even explain why on earth they act the way they do, why on earth they behave the way they do, why on earth they even believe what they believe. When that happens, we shouldn't be surprised based on the source. Because when we examine what's gone on in particularly the West over the last, let's just very roughly call it 200 years, we will understand why we are where we are. As much of a deal as was made of men like Charles Darwin and those who progenerated the idea of the natural selection of species, and particularly the origin of that, of at least the early days of evolutionary theory, as much note as they came to be of, as many cities like Darwin in the Northern Territory have been named after them, they really weren't the progenitors of these ideas. These ideas of a desire, a rampant desire to cast off what to those men were the shackles of religion. That's what the Enlightenment era was. A self-described enlightenment in which we've done away with the shackles of Christianity, with the moral and philosophical and theological constraints, and we now know the truth. We now can actually evolve as a species. But what men like Darwin and others around him provided for the world was a great excuse. What one might even term the great Darwinian excuse. And the very fundamental ideology, and I say ideology specifically, because to give it credence as a genuine, sincerely held, objectively rational scientific theory, under the actual definition of a scientific theory, is to pretend that it's not deeply pagan in its ideology, and it would be to pretend that it's not just the fanciful machinations of people who are trying to find any possible excuse to justify their rebellion against God. But that part aside, the impact of the proverbial Pandora's box that Darwin opened directly resulted on a baseline fundamental level in the atrocities and the great death and calamity that we saw across the 20th century. The wars, especially World War I, are often referred to sometimes as the scientific wars. These wars of machinery, these wars of humans elevating themselves and seeking dominance, wars that involved concepts like eugenics under the Reich. All this is Darwinian in nature. All of it was naturalistic, was materialistic, was secular. The atrocities of the deaths under communism, an inherently atheistic worldview that again does away with the divine, does away with any sense of sovereignty or accountability above ourselves, is a direct result of these philosophies and ideologies. The 100 million people that died under communism approximately in the 20th century alone, and that's just the 20th century, is a direct result of this ideology. It's a direct result broadly of what happens when humanity does away, firstly, with the divine, does away with any concept of God above, any concept of divine, sovereign rulership and accountability, and then as a result of that, morally justifies themselves in doing away with a verse like Genesis 1, verse 27. Because when we are simply animals, when we are simply bags of flesh and fluid with nothing more going on here than the random assortment of time and chance acting on the chemicals in our brain, when that is all that we are, what on earth could possibly be wrong with the enslavement, internment, and absolute annihilation of 6 million Jews? What on earth could possibly be wrong with the conquest of Eastern Europe and the destruction of 40 million people under the Soviet Union? What on earth could be wrong with the destruction and the annihilation, largely by famine, of 70 million people under Mao Zedong and the Communist Chinese Party? What on earth? Let me take it a step further. There's a very obvious event going on in Eastern Europe right now, which has flooded our news feeds, which has apparently done away with COVID. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. But nevertheless, in a world in which the predominant ideology among governments in the West is that of secularism, namely that there is no divine authority, there is no God above them, above the state, there is no God above society, that we are all just an eclectic, mosaic collection of different little cultural ideologies and so on. In that world, how on earth can you possibly say, with any sense of intellectual or moral consistency whatsoever, that one tribe of primates invading another tribe of primates is somehow morally wrong? The inherent logical contradiction, before we even begin talking about the moral one, blows the mind. By what standard are the actions of the Russians wrong? By whose standard? By your secular, naturalistic standard that has no God in heaven who sets the standard? Before we even begin to think about the fact that that secularism has been coupled with postmodernism and the denial of objective truth, which we're looking at next week. It's a joke. It's an absolute joke, and a bad one at that, because it's completely contradictory. What on earth could it possibly matter? But that's what happens. That's what happens when you've inherited thousands of years of Christian heritage. That's what happens when you're afforded the luxury to even think in these rebellious ways, because of the fact that you've inherited a Christian society, because you have inherited Christian biblical principles of governance and of polity and of law and so on. Where on the one hand, people can educate our children and our grandchildren that they're nothing more than animals in a world that is nothing more than the physical and the material, that there is no objective truth, there is no objective reality, there is no objective logic, there is no objective rationality. But yet, what those Russians are doing is objectively wrong. This isn't a commentary on me telling you, on somehow picking a side. That's not what I'm talking about. Right? I understand the wisdom in what I'm saying. What I'm highlighting is the rank moral hypocrisy and ideological insanity and irrationality that pervades these kinds of things. Because if indeed we are not made in the image of God, for there is no God, all of this goes out the window. Because as we examined for 5 weeks, who is it that defines morality and law? God. That's why postmodernism was the logical conclusion that would come about eventually particularly the 90s and coming through to now. Because as much as you tried to elevate humanity, as much as you tried to elevate the proverbial enlightened wisdom of man, well, it got us 2 world wars and hundreds of millions of people dead. So, of course, the only thing we could turn to, there is no God who defines truth and reality or morality. We as humans are not capable of defining truth, reality, and morality. Therefore, it doesn't objectively exist. It is purely subjective, if it even exists at all. We need to have a really profound and committed ideological, philosophical, and theological outworking of this concept of the Imago Dei, of the fact that we as people are created in the image of God. Because for too long now we have been completely unnecessarily intimidated by the academic high ivory tower of evolutionary thinking, to stay on that topic, that has come forward to us for decades now. So often we've run because we haven't known how to answer it. Because when self-proclaimed experts try and tell us something, we have quivered. Okay? And it's not a specific attack, it's a very general comment that I'm making. Right, when you actually dive into the specifics of the various evolutionary models, especially the canon one, the one that is predominant today, that is unquestionable, which is a hilarious concept in itself, you actually understand quite quickly the fact that there is no one who does more ideological eisegesis than an evolutionist, than a Darwinian, who looks at the reality of legitimate scientific findings and then completely assumes and plants their naturalism, their materialistic view onto that. It's actually quite weird looking back on it for me, kind of mainly doing theological work in the 2010s now into the 2020s, to look back on the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, which is when this stuff was at its height in terms of the popular social conscience. It's weird looking back at it at my age, and I often can't reconcile why we so often were afraid of it or intimidated by them. Because it's actually quite a laughable idea when you examine it. It's deeply and profoundly pagan. It is, by very definition, exactly what Paul was talking about in Romans 1, for example, right? About the worshipping of creatures and of the creation. Not in terms of an idolatrous sense, in terms of setting up shrines to apes. I'm talking about the way in which they have viewed and consolidated this idea that we are nothing more than apes. that we are nothing more than that which is managed by pure luck and chance to have evolved and been dominant down throughout the ages. Because it impacts things like what we read from verse 28 onward. Right, let me refresh your memory to what that is from verse 28. And God blessed them, speaking of these people that he has made in his image. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. It's not even just the actual substantive nature at that point. It's now about purpose. It's now not just about nature and substance. It's about the very mission that this specific creature, us humans, have in the world. To be fruitful, to multiply, right? To establish households, to establish clans, to establish tribes, to establish societies. And to have dominion over all things of the earth. To have dominion over it all. Nature, imago Dei, image of God. Purpose, teleological purpose. Be fruitful and multiply, or just simply multiply and have dominion. It's speaking to the ontological nature and the teleological purpose, to put it in philosophical terms. That message builds the foundation of all of our theology. It builds the foundation of what we believe about Christ himself. We have to have a high view of that and have to be absolutely unapologetic and uncompromising in our total declaration of what we've read here this morning. Because we are in an ideological battle. We are in a theological battle. We are in a spiritual battle. We're in a war that we have perhaps long forgotten, I might submit humbly, where we think that what's going on out there is just neutral. Right, we'll be addressing that in 2 weeks' time. The myth of neutrality, that secularism as an ideology is just a neutral referee and lets all the little religions and the ideologies that are the players run around the field, and it just keeps everything in check. Blows the whistle when someone goes out of bounds. Ta-da. No. It's very evolutionary in its behaviour, which makes sense. Namely that it seeks to be dominant and to be the fittest. Why? Because the fittest survive. Because the dominant survive. The apex predator wins. That we'll be covering in 2 weeks' time. But nevertheless, we have to be able to have a reason for the faith that we hold, to use the language of the New Testament. We have to understand these principles, not just as nice kind of generic Christian concepts that we kind of loosely hold in the basket of what it is that Christianity is, but rather that we actually can confidently, strongly, decisively and definitively proclaim truth into a society that has en masse abandoned concepts like truth, that has reverted to a baseline default level of pure materialism and naturalism, that rejects and rebels against any concept of a divine and sovereign authority above itself. The fortunate thing that we can do, at least at this point in our society, the fortunate thing that lies in our advantage, is kind of what I touched on earlier. The fact that we are not existing or moving into a brand, like in terms of brand new from our perspective, into a pagan culture. We have the advantage of not being like the missionaries going into Daneland or into the pagan north of the Vikings. A deep pagan culture which has no Christian context whatsoever, and you're moving into that environment with something against it. We have the advantage of having an unbelievably rich heritage that many of the people who deny God and who are in abject rebellion against him are still living in and amongst. Concepts like the rule of law, you can thank God for that. Concepts like truth or like righteousness, these kinds of concepts that people still to varying degrees hold, you can thank God for that. You can thank Christians for that. All these various things, so that we can be in a position where, when either individuals or people in position of power, or whatever the nature of it happens to be, we can point to the fact that they are directly contravening not just the truth of Scripture, but indeed what, to use the phrase, what this country stands for. The values that this country actually used to hold. Because that element becomes vital in how we actually push back, how we actually be light. You might recall back in our series Lecture X, we referenced from the Sermon on the Mount the concept of being the light of the world, right? In partnership with salt of the earth, salt being a preservative, it defends, it preserves, it maintains. Light goes forth, it's offensive. It goes forward into darkness and drives it back, simply by going forward and doing its job or being what it is. We only do that when A, we understand the nature and the beliefs of the proverbial ideological enemy, and B, just as if not more importantly, actually understand what on earth it is that we're trying to advance. What it is, this gospel that we are proclaiming to the world, and what is its theological basis. Because the realities of what this ideology has done in our society could get just exorbitantly worse. The logical conclusions of the rebellion and the rejection of God is the definition of chaos. I'll tell you this, just a very brief anecdote. And it might be surprising to hear me say this, but listen to the whole point that I'm making. One Enlightenment era figure, so kind of think 16, 17, 1800s, one Enlightenment era figure, non-Christian, that I respect the most is a French nobleman and author by the name of Donatien Alphonse François, Le Marquis de Sade, right, or simply the Marquis de Sade. Right, that was his title. He was what was called a libertine. Libertine meaning, obviously you can see the connection with the word liberty. Libertine meaning in that context of the Enlightenment, especially in France and Western Europe, a declaration ideologically of A, total complete rejection of God, the church, the whole nine yards. Secondly, of absolute liberty, meaning complete rejection of religion, complete rejection of morality, complete rejection of any lawful constraint whatsoever. The most full, comprehensive, complete, abject rejection of any boundaries whatsoever. And there are a number of renowned libertines, especially amongst the French aristocracy and nobility, as well as the British. He's the one I respect the most because of his absolute consistency of ideological belief. When you read some of his works, like his magnum opus called 120 Days in Sodom, I don't recommend you read it unless you have the stomach for it and unless you read it for its purpose, because the entire purpose of the story is, how on earth do I censor this as appropriate in a church setting, is 4 aristocratic men who basically go on a winter holiday to a castle in the Schwarzwald in Germany, in the Black Forest, to engage in quite literally every possible form of sexual immorality that you could ever conjure, ever. And there is no boundary to what you imagine. You think of it, in its most depraved form, it's there, with zero boundary, probably beyond what you and many of us are actually capable of imagining, and is declared as good. Why? And this is the reason I actually respect Le Marquis de Sade, because he took this idea of secularism, he took this idea of Darwinian naturalism, followed it down the train track to the end of the line. Do you see? All he was doing, from a pragmatic perspective, was taking the rejection of God and rebellion against him and playing it out to its logical conclusions. Rejection of all morality, rejection of all law, rejection of all true religion. That's the consequences. When you are nothing more than an animal, that is the consequence. And that root ideology is exactly what will be taught to your children and grandchildren this time tomorrow, at a baseline ideological level. Does that sound like something that we perhaps, maybe, I suppose, should stand up and fight against? Does that sound like darkness that we as light should be pushing back against? Absolutely, fundamentally, categorically. What we've looked at today in this concept of being made in the image of God, and the vitality of that to our theology will then be paired with what comes next week. Those two things then get coupled in light of what we looked at for us last week to then be moving into week 4. So these things all connect thematically. But nevertheless, the fundamental theological reality of us being made in the image of God is vital for us to comprehend, to elevate, to proclaim. As we stand, not just for generic concepts of truth, as good as that actually is, but rather because this directly impacts the very fundamental gospel message that we proclaim forth to the world. Concepts like salvation from sin are ridiculous to an ideology that denies the very concept of sin as well as the very concept of a God who can save. Let us understand this not for the sake of academia, but rather for the sake of the truth of the Bible and of the gospel itself. Amen.